Welcome back, everybody. We're going to turn our attention to the question of identity development and how it relates to race. In this video, we'll focus on people of color who are living in a white-dominated society. More specifically, we'll address the question of how one's racial identity as a BIPOC person emerges. In the next video, we'll do the same with white people, though the emphasis will be on developing an anti-racist white identity. The stages we'll be going over apply to all oppressed racial ethnic groups. But as we go through this, keep in mind the applicability of this material to other forms of stratification. What's very interesting, for example, is how this process bears striking resemblance to queer people's coming out process and identity development. So, while our focus here is on race, the same underlying model can apply to other oppressed groups. Also keep in mind that identity development is a rather complicated process, so what we're going to look at is known as an ideal type, meaning that it's an abstraction from an analysis of many different people's experiences. What this means is that it won't perfectly represent any one person's experience. Instead, it represents what is, collectively speaking, the most typical experience. In other words, each individual's unique identity development may mean, for example, that they go through some of these stages more than once, depending on the circumstances in their lives. Okay, with these preliminaries out of the way, let's look at the stages of racial identity development for people of color in a white-dominated society. In this video, I'm just going to present the model of identity development. When we meet together as a class, we'll examine some examples. The first stage in the racial identity development for people of color is called the pre-encounter. At this stage, the individual, most commonly a child, internalizes many of the beliefs and values of the dominant white culture, including the idea that it's, quote, better to be white. So this stage is where internalized racism is most evident. There's also a tendency to minimize both the personal and social significance of race. Individuals at this stage may think, oh, being Asian or Latinx isn't important, it's not relevant to me, we're all human beings. Individuals at this stage are also likely to value role models, lifestyles, and value systems of the dominant group more highly than those of their own culture. While this preference for whiteness in the dominant culture is typical, it doesn't necessarily hold true for everybody. If a child grows up in an environment with explicitly positive Afrocentric attitudes, Native-centric attitudes, and so on, they may absorb a pro-Black or a pro-Native perspective, which becomes their own starting point in the exploration of their racial identity. But as you well know, it's extremely difficult to remove one's self from white culture because it's so pervasive. And without this kind of environment, a person of color ends up wanting to assimilate and be accepted to fit in with the dominant culture of society, which is white. The next stage is called the encounter. You'll find that this stage typically begins during later childhood or adolescence, but it doesn't have to. It can begin earlier or later as well, depending on one's circumstances. The transition to this stage is precipitated by an event or series of events that forces the individual to acknowledge the personal impact of racism. This encounter usually elicits emotions like anger, confusion, alienation, and a sense of betrayal. As a result, there's much anger at white people, white culture, and white authority. Suddenly, the individual is very aware of the rejection they get from the white world, and so they begin to grapple with what it means to be a member of a group targeted by racism. As a result of this encounter, you'll find that the individual's consciousness is transformed. And so they start trying to really define their racial ethnic identity. The problem is that this initial interpretation of racial identity is usually based on the stereotypes they have internalized about their own group. So there's a sense that I have to be this way to be a real Hmong person, or Latinx person, or Native person, and the image available is a very narrow one. The third stage is called immersion. The way to remember these words is to think of immersing yourself in your own culture like being immersed in water. When you've done that, you can then emerge as a new person. This stage is characterized by the desire to surround yourself with visible symbols of your racial identity. There is an active avoidance of symbols of whiteness and a rejection of anything seen as representing white culture. At the beginning of this stage, there's a tendency to categorically reject white people and white culture and glorify one's own group. So this stage is very similar to the withdrawal response to being stigmatized, where you dramatize the stigma and separate from the dominant culture. For example, the individual actively seeks out opportunities to learn about their own racial history and culture together with peers from the same racial group. At that point, the anger may begin to subside because the focus moves away from reacting to white rejection to a focus on exploring one's racial group and oneself. The result is a newly defined and, more importantly, newly affirmed sense of self. The final stage in the development of racial identity for people of color in a white-dominated society is called internalization. It's a much less reactionary response to white people, largely because it's characterized by a sense of security in one's racial ethnic identity. At this stage, the individual is able to view their own group more objectively, recognizing people as individuals, and that, for example, just because we're the same race doesn't mean we're on the same page regarding racial issues. People are people first, not the group they represent. This kind of objectivity is directed not only toward members of one's own group, but also towards the members of other groups. In other words, individuals at this stage recognize that it's counterproductive to lump people together as if they are all the same. Instead, they differentiate among white people, for example, recognizing that there are some white people who are trying to work against the prevailing system of racial oppression, at the same time that there are problem white people. Because of this objectivity, these individuals are also willing to establish meaningful relationships with people of all different races, including those white people who acknowledge and are respectful of their self-definition as a person of color. And not only that, but those in this internalization stage are ready to build coalitions with members of other oppressed groups, and so are more likely to begin reaching out to others. In other words, one's sense of community and solidarity extends across racial ethnic lines. So, that covers the 4 stages of identity development for people of color in a white-dominated society. Just remember that this is an ideal type, and as such, it only captures the overall pattern found among people of color taken as a group. Individual experiences of their racial identity development are going to show variations. So, for example, you may find people who move back and forth through these stages over the course of their lifetimes, or as they move from one situation to another. Others may skip a stage. Again, there is no universal model of identity development that fits everyone equally well. There's only the ideal type, which captures what is most common among the members of this group of people.